Welcome, everybody. I can see we are getting some folks into the main room here, getting connected to audio. So thank you for joining us today. Welcome to the second installment of the OIE Targeted Technical Assistance Series focused on logic models and data-driven decision making. We're going to get started on this second series, but no worries if you weren't able to join us for the first one. We'll make sure that we get you caught up, and you'll have no problem getting jumping right in and joining us for today's session. So I see a few more folks are getting their audio connected. If you don't already have the chat box open, go ahead and open that up and say hello to your fellow grantees in the chat box there. I expect that we'll have a few more people joining us here as we get started. But since we have a pretty full agenda and a lot of things we want to share and talk with you about today, I'm going to go ahead and get us going. So thank you. And I see everyone starting to say hello in the chat box. Hello, good afternoon. Mino Bimadziwin, it's good to see you all. I'm going to go ahead now and play our standard disclaimer.
This presentation was produced under U.S. Department of Education contract number GS00F115CA with Synergy Enterprises, Inc. The views expressed herein do not necessarily represent the positions or policies of the U.S. Department of Education. No official endorsement by the U.S. Department of Education of any product, commodity, service, or enterprise mentioned herein is intended or should be inferred.
Okay. Thank you for that standard disclaimer. My name is Tracy Madej George. I'll be here today as one of your main co-facilitators, and I'm joined by Miss Sherry. Would you like to say hello?
Yes, welcome everybody. I'm Sherry Lawver, and just delighted to be here to talk more about logic modeling today.
We're also joined by our fellow OIE technical assistance team members today. We have all of us present today to give us a hand in our breakout rooms. So a little later today, you'll get to interact with them, but we're joined today by Olani Lilly, Sarah Brightwell, Sarah Whitehead, Miranda Cairns, and also, of course, Rashad, who's on. He's our technical guru. He can give us any help if you have any problems with audio or moving around in the breakout rooms. Just drop us a line in the chat box and we're here to help. So thank you all for joining us today. Let's go ahead and see what's in store for today. So we're going to pick up sort of where we left off from last week and review some basic elements of a logic model and have a little fun with that to begin. We'll provide some work time in small groups, in grant-alike groups, or mostly grant-alike groups, where you can have some work time to complete or reflect on the logic model that you maybe are starting or have started. And then finally, we'll explore some connections about how your logic model can help guide program evaluation and some data-informed decision making around your logic model and make those connections. So here's how that will play out in our agenda. We're going to have a little fun and play a little game with a logic model lingo to refresh everybody's memory. So if you weren't able to join us on that first day, we'll help get you up to speed with that. We'll give you some work time to complete and reflect on the logic model. We've sent out after the last session and before this session, we had shared some materials, some templates. We'll also be putting those into the chat box. So don't worry about if you didn't get those, don't worry about tracking them down. We'll make sure that you can grab them from our chat box here in a little bit. Then we'll get more into that, some common types of evaluation, how that connects to your logic model. And then we'll wrap up by sharing some next steps and hope that you'll be able to join us for our third session next week on June 22nd related to data-driven decision making. Okay. So thank you for continuing to say hello there in the chat box. It's nice to see some familiar faces and names. Before we dive into everything on our agenda, we want to get a read on our audience here. So we're going to open up with this quick poll that we'd like for you to respond to. And this is not a gotcha moment. This is just there's no right or wrong answer. We just want to kind of know where everybody is today. How are you feeling after day one? Were you not able to attend day one? That's cool. If you're joining us here for the first time, maybe after day one, you feel like you understand some basic elements, but you're feeling a little confused about how to make that your own, or maybe you're a little further up on that continuum. You know, you're feeling good, but maybe need a little help, or you're ready to go and you've been working on your logic model all week. That poll should be coming up here so you can respond to that, and we'll give you a few minutes. There we go. I see it now. Hopefully you see that on your screen. All right, lots of responses right away. Excellent. We got 16 responses, 20 responses, 21 responses. It looks like kind of an even spread, but some folks are joining us for the first time. That's great. We're glad to have you here today. About an equal number or somewhere in the middle, learned a lot, still have a lot of questions. Great. Please feel free as we go through. We'll have some moments to pause and for you to come off mute and ask questions, but also feel free to use the chat box liberally along the way. Put your comments and questions and ideas in there so we can lift those up along the way as well. Looks like a couple of you kind of took week one and ran with it, and you've been working on it. So that's great too. Thank you everyone for sharing. Looks like we got 30 of us responding to that. Excellent. Well, no matter what your answer was, you are in the right place. So let's begin with a little review. Review some key terms. So you may recall that we spent some time on the first session looking, defining what some basic logic model components are. So I'm going to read these prompts and feel free to type into the chat box if you have an answer or a guess. What is the term that you use to refer to the resources that go into the program? Feel free to type into the chat box, or maybe you're just queuing that up in your mind from last time. Does anybody recall the term that we use to call the resources that go into the program? Exactly right, Clarence. Inputs. Perfect. Very good. All right, how about the next one? What is the term that we use to describe that we call the activities that the program undertakes? Anybody? The activities that the program undertakes. What do we call that? Anybody? Okay, strategies. It could be strategies. Not wrong. The word I was looking for was outputs. Outputs, tasks, activities. Very good. Okay. And then how about this last one here? Changes or benefits that result from our program or efforts. What is the term that we use to refer to the changes or benefits? Excellent. Yes, Doug, Jeremy got it right away. Outcomes. Perfect. Thank you for playing along with that. Just a quick review. So inputs are all of those resources, the facilities, the human capital and expertise, the program investments that are really needed for successful implementation, so that we can carry out those activities. Outputs may include the actual activities or tasks, and participation by the audience or the population of focus. But mostly when we think of outputs or activities, sometimes we call them, we think of those elements that can be counted. And then finally, outcomes, right? These could be short-term, midterm, or long-term changes and benefits that we are aiming for that result from the program activities. And I would want to take just a minute too to highlight how, because I like how this slide lays it out here when we think about short and medium and long-term outcomes. I liked this because it kind of helped me think about how I might categorize each of those. The short terms, if we think about those as like what is learned as a result of our program. Medium terms could be the actions that then take place as a result of my new learning. And then the longer term outcomes are those ultimate benefits. So I learned something, I took action, and then there was, that overarching or ultimate benefit. I thought that was kind of helpful. All right. Oops, get my cursor in the right spot here. Very good. Okay, so let's play another little game here. I'm going to put up some examples on the screen, and we're going to put up a poll where you can submit your answer. So it'll be a little bit anonymous. We won't know who's answering what, but I'll put some examples up, and you can tell us if you think that example is an input, an output, or if it belongs in one of these categories of outcomes: short-term, medium-term, or long-term outcomes. Okay, everyone ready to play? Here we go. So our first example is teens learn new leadership skills. And you have a poll on your screen right now, so you can tell us by vote. Is that a long-term outcome, a medium-term outcome, an input? Is it an output? Looks like we've got about 16 responses here. Lots of folks are putting it in the outcomes category. Kind of an even split though, short, medium, or long-term outcomes. We've got a few folks who put it into an output. All right, let's go ahead and see where this one lands. Oops. There we go. Like a little Plinko chip, it's going to land right by short-term outcomes. So it's a benefit or an impact. And you might recall from the previous slide that teens learn new leadership skills. We put that into the short-term outcome category. All right, thank you for that first one. Let's take a look at another example here. Books were distributed to children. So I think our poll is going to refresh, and you'll be able to vote for where you think this one belongs. If you think books being distributed to children is an input, an output, or is it an outcome? Oh, right away, output jumped to the lead. Okay, some folks have put it into an input category. Okay, let's see where this one landed. Okay, this one we put into the output category, or sometimes we label it activities and outputs, but those things that can be counted, a tangible product that can be counted. So that's why we put that into outputs. All right, next example. 2 agencies partnered to design the program. Which category would you put this into? Ooh, everybody so far says inputs. Okay. Somebody saying an output. Let's see. Indeed, inputs is where we categorize that. So a partnership was formed to design that program. So that was necessary in order to carry out those activities. Very good. Excellent. All right. How about this next one? Greater percentage of high school students graduate. Which bucket would you put this fall into? a greater percentage of high school students graduate. Okay, a lot of folks are saying outcomes. Looks like long-term outcome is in the lead. Some are saying outputs or something that can be counted. Long-term outcomes is where we categorize that. Definitely it is something that can be counted, it can be quantified, the number of students that graduate, but we were thinking of this in terms of one of those longer ultimate benefits that goes into that long-term outcome category. All right, a few more here. Volunteers provide over 300 hours of support to the project. Where would you put this one? Which bucket would you put this ball into? A lot of folks are saying inputs, okay. Got a few saying outputs and then maybe some medium term outcomes. All right, well, let's see where this one lands. All right, we put that one into inputs. Inputs is where we put volunteers providing 300 hours of project support, with the thought that this is really something that's needed to deliver the program, and therefore a necessary input. All right, next up, we have newsletters are distributed in 3 languages. Thank you everyone for continuing to play along here. Folks are thinking about this one a little bit. Looks like outputs. Okay, most are saying outputs. There we go. And indeed, we put that into the outputs category. So it relates to an activity, something that can be counted, and therefore an output. All right, everyone's doing great. We got a couple of more here for you. This one is, the example is, teens use language skills to teach a song to younger children in the program. Where would you put this ball? Teens use language skills to teach a song to younger children in the program. Okay, kind of few, looks like this one's getting votes for all the categories, but the one in the lead is medium term outcomes. Whoops, sorry, got a little quick with my clicking. There we go. So this one, you see it landed kind of right in the middle of that short and medium term outcome. So it could be an indicator. It could be you know, that evidence of learning, that teens are learning a language skill, and then they're teaching it to somebody else. So it's kind of an example of both learning and doing. So both answers seem right in this case. All right, I think we have at least one more. This example is youth attend 35 hours of language activities. Which bucket would you put that into? Outputs jumped right to the lead. Okay. Go ahead and click here, see where this one lands. And outputs is the winner. Yes, so again, something indicative of those activities, something we can count and quantify as an output. All right, well, thank you everyone for playing along. I agree that that's a fun little activity that you can you know, do in PowerPoint with the animation. If hopefully you got refreshed on our terminology that we're going to be using today, that we started off with last week, and maybe got a new idea for an activity along the way too. So thank you. So You might be wondering to yourself, like, why would we suggest that a logic model is useful for you in your grant program? And maybe some of these thoughts have passed through your head, either last week or even today, like this seems like a lot of work, or this logic modeling just isn't the way my brain thinks. um, where in the world would I get the information to put in a logic model? Or even if I had one, if I created one, what would I actually do with a logic model? And we don't want to suggest that creating a logic model is just for the sake of the exercise, where it's sits on a shelf or a website never to be looked at again, but rather we are suggesting that by engaging in this kind of careful and detailed thought process to document the plan for achieving those desired outcomes and having those necessary conversations with stakeholders and staff, that you're really better able to make use of the resources that you have, to be more productive and even leverage potential new sources of support. We actually have a couple of stories. Sherry, you had some recent conversations and examples that really nicely illustrate that idea of why a logic model could be so helpful for your program.
Absolutely, Tracy. Someone brought up a really important question last week. This person said, we have such urgency and such great need in our community to develop language learning. Our elders are getting older and we are losing time. Why should we bother with activities like this when it seems like language development and establishing a curriculum are the most important aspects of our work? It's a relevant question. It is something to think about. And so we discussed this question in our small group, and we came to the conclusion that when you feel such tremendous urgency, you can often work and kind of almost live in a panicked state. And that does not always lead itself to the most efficient use of time or resources. So partialing out just even a small amount of time for strategic planning, and this is part of strategic planning, will help you maximize your resources, demonstrate your effectiveness, and possibly even gain new funding for your program because you're demonstrating its effectiveness. And so other funders are very interested in your work. So that's one situation that I thought was valuable to share here. And I think Sarah Brightwell also wanted to share a story from her experience.
If I can get myself unmuted.
Sorry, Sarah.
No, it was my computer, not you. Yeah, so we were just sharing that we have a grantee who, was working and kind of going through the same thing where they were kind of contemplating, do I have time for this? Do I have time to engage in the logic model? But really figured out that by taking that time, they were better able to direct their resources and actually preserve more of what they were trying to. They were able to do more activities and do more with less because they had a coherent plan in place. So it's something that at least the grantees that we have worked with previously through this process have found beneficial and have helped them to be more productive and to be able to secure additional funds to sustain their programming.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. And I had also shared a story. I was working with a not-for-profit organization in the St. Louis area, right around the Ferguson, Missouri area, and they were implementing teacher home visits. And it was an expensive program that required a lot of support from teachers who were going to be implementing home visits in the summertime before the school year began. And so when I began working with them as an evaluator, my first question is, well, what do you ultimately hope to see happen as the result of this program? And everybody kind of stopped and they said, well, we know it's good for the community. And I said, of course it is. Anytime connections are made between teachers and families, it's valuable time spent. But do you have, short-term, medium-term, or long-term outcomes that you hope to see happen here? And that ended up leading to them having a sidebar conversation as a group and thinking about what they hoped to happen. You know, they wanted connections to be made between teachers and families. They wanted families to be comfortable coming to the school. And ultimately, they wanted children to be reading more at home. They wanted to see academic progress. If we hadn't had that logic model conversation and tried to put all of that down on a piece of paper, it never would have been clear to them. As a result, they shared a 2-page document that included their logic model with local companies. And they had a significant donation made, which expanded their program to 12 districts in St. Louis as a result. And I like to think that part of that big win of expansion was this very process. So I just thought we'd share that as some of the examples of why this might be important.
I think those are really, really helpful examples and real life examples, right, of folks who are working with the urgency and the pressures of the realities of their program and how that was able to help them. Last week, we shared a number of benefits of having a logic model. So on the screen right now are some of those things, but I'm wondering if you can think of others. I'll give you a moment just to read what's on the screen and maybe just thinking about last week if you were able to join us, or the stories that we just shared, that you have other thoughts about how a logic model can be beneficial. I see Crystal writes, logic models showcase a planned process. Absolutely. It can be a great communication tool. Mm-hmm.
I think also with when you're outlining what you want your benefits to be, your long-term, short-term, and medium-term, you can then analyze what activities you're going to use. What activities can I do that is going to help me or help the participants connect so that those outcomes are more successful?
Yeah, I think the process and the conversations that you have while you're developing and really thinking through that deliberate connection between those activities and the outcomes, just like you said, Crystal, excellent, very good. Improved planning and management. Another excellent reason, provides a solid framework for developing a grant narrative to a potential funder. Absolutely, good example, Lisa. Excellent. Well, thank you for sharing those. So if you were with us last week, you may have started and engaged in some partner conversations where we did a little interview exercise to prime that pump of thinking about what are my program inputs, what do we do, who do we serve, and who benefits. But if you are new to the session today, no problem. We'll talk through a few things, and then we're going to get into some grant alike groups and actually do a little bit of working together to work on a logic model. So if we think of logic models as a visual organizer, you can really use any kind of graphic that makes sense to you. You know, we've shared several examples of those typical linear formats, you know, that use boxes and arrows, but maybe you want something that's more circular or dynamic. You could use a table or a flow chart in your word processing programs, or even, you know, there's tools within Word, like the Smart Art tool that could also be used to develop a logic model. They come in all shapes and sizes, and we did share some other examples as well, but essentially we want them to be visually engaging, to include that appropriate level of detail so that those essential elements are conveyed, but it's not too difficult to read, that it's easy to understand, so that we're using language that resonates with the audience. And we did talk too about having perhaps different graphics for the same logic model, depending on your audience. But it should be reflective of the context in which your program operates. So here is an example that we had shared during the first session, and we also provided in some templates that use this this sort of classic Kellogg model of a logic model. So it includes, as you recall, the population of focus. In this case, this is a program model about reducing and preventing youth tobacco use. You see that in this one, they actually include another category here of reach, where they list other groups and stakeholders that they want to also target and impact. Those inputs, those program inputs, all those resources that go into making those activities happen are listed. Those activities you see here, they start to use those arrows to connect with the groups that they want to have an impact on. And then they list out in the short, medium, and long-term outcomes. Again, using those arrows to connect, to show very explicitly how they expect to move from short to medium to other medium, and then long-term outcomes. Okay. Very good. So we explored several examples that were those very linear or maybe mechanistic, or some might even say like Eurocentric type models. But we also considered in the first session some ways that a logic model could be designed to resonate with the Native communities and audiences that we serve. So we started reflecting on, what were some maybe aesthetic elements, such as the imagery or the shapes and the colors, and touched on the idea of incorporating Native language into the logic model as a way to sort of indigenize that model, right? Because indigenous paradigms and languages matter in the communities that we serve. And really, in keeping with our theme from our recent project directors meeting this year, our history, our story, our way, we really wanted to carve out some time to support you in lifting indigenous ways of knowing and thinking about the world, and how that might look in your logic model. Now I say on the screen, it says rediscover an indigenous logic model. And that's because, we recognize that not all of us were raised hearing our native languages and stories. Or your reality might be that you're working in a Native community that's different than the one that you grew up in. And for some of us, we're new to working in Native communities altogether. So we're all really at different places along this continuum of cultural knowledge. And many of us are actively rediscovering our languages and stories and cultural practices. So you might already have an idea of for what an indigenous model could look like and be on your way to developing one. But I suspect that there's a lot of us who are really wondering how to go beyond those surface elements, or maybe the aesthetic elements of the logic model, to go a little bit deeper. So we're suggesting that Native languages, traditional stories, and ancestral practices are starting points where we can explore and rediscover those indigenous paradigms. An example from my own experience came a couple of decades ago while I was working at a Native Studies department in a small Midwestern university, where my director was thinking about new classes or new courses to offer to the university students, and was really focused on education, because there was a strong education department too that produced a lot of teachers for the area. And one way he really wanted to promote the Native perspective on education. And so one of the first things that he did was to approach one of our language teachers and asked her what would be the Ojibwe word for education. And the word and translation that she gave to us was kinomage. The earth, she shows us the way. And just that word and that translation really gives us some insight about how that indigenous or Ojibwe way of thinking about education is really different than what we think of as typical schooling in our society today. And so native language could be one avenue that can like reveal those insights about what an indigenous logic model could look like. Stories are another way that those ways of knowing are communicated from one generation to the next. So our TA team and some of your grantees, fellow grantee colleagues have actually given this a little bit of thought about how our traditional stories can help us to rediscover and define an Indigenous logic model, particularly stories about change makers or changing phenomenon and how those can be studied through a lens of impact or systemic change. I'm going to put a few elements on the screen here and talk through them just briefly. And as I do that, I encourage you to listen for things to investigate when you're exploring and studying those ancestral stories, and how these elements might be extrapolated to elements of a logic model that we've been talking about, those inputs, those activities, outputs, and outcomes. I'll talk through them generally, and then Olani has graciously agreed to share an example of how she did just that, kind of studying a traditional story and how that helped reveal an approach to an Indigenous logic model. So here I'll talk through each of these briefly now. How can our stories tell us about how we go about making an impact or change? The first idea is about constructs of time, that it could be seasonal or cyclical, or maybe there's clues about the correct time for certain tasks. There's often teachings within our stories about ceremony or protocols, or how to ask for permission, or how to honor what's given and shared, or it may be preparing for the right mindset when approaching a task. A lot of times impact is more communal than about individual gain. Lessons about relationships with really everything, with each other, as well as with our ancestors and the generations yet to be born, as well as our current active life with animals, the plants, and the earth itself. The importance of preparation and training for new tasks or leadership roles could be something to listen for. And looking at and reflecting on patterns of all sorts of nature, of behavior. And then listening for those characters in our stories that have an impact on change, on long-standing practices.
Hi, Patrick. This is Brittany calling from East Village. How are you?
Oh, wasn't sure if somebody wanted to chime in there with something that they learned. Olani, I'm going to turn it over to you to kind of share with us now how you did just that with the traditional story.
Hello, everyone. I'm Olani, and prior to coming to this work, I worked within Hawaiian language and culture-based immersion school. One of the things we wanted to do was look at how do we do school turnaround and change within our organization. And so we started to delve into some stories and really got hooked into the story of Maui. There's a song that was written by Israel Kamakawiwa Ole called Maui the Hawaiian Superman. And really Maui is a character that is pervasive in Polynesia, not just in Hawaii. And so what we did was we looked at Maui, the character, and then into his story. Maui is known as being very mischievous and a troublemaker. He has these amazing feats. For example, he creates a lasso and he goes up to Haleakala on Maui and he lassos the sun in order to slow it down so that his mother, Hina, could continue to have enough hours in the day to dry her exquisite kapa. That was our clothing. He also uses a magical fish hook called Manaiakalani and throws it into the water and engages his other Maui brothers to pull up the islands. He also grabs alai, which is a native bird, and captures alai because the fire has gone out. And alai, this bird, knows the secrets to how to restart the fire. So he captures a lie and chokes him until he screams out the secret of how to restart a fire. So these were all really, like, when I was growing up as a child, like, it was very mysterious and these amazing, like, Superman feats. But when you look at it from a change maker context, it really changes the dynamic of the story. We have a genealogical chant called the Kumulipo, which is about 2,102 lines, and it really takes a chief and it connects him to the beginning of time, to the beginning of the first, to the beginning of the ocean. It's sort of our Genesis story. And within that chant, that long chant, there is this section about Maui. And so what we did was, as a group, we got together and we took that Maui part and we, what we call, deconstructed it. And so it is in Hawaiian language. And so we looked at it, we read it first literally, and then we looked and we dissected every word and we looked at all the possibilities of the meaning. And then we applied a change maker lens. And this is what we got. So the first part, thanks, Tracy. The first part is tells us about Kiailoa and Kiaipoko, and these are his Maui's mother's two brothers, and they are of the old mindset. And so, in order for Maui to even begin this change process, he needed to change the mindset. Now, in the story, he actually killed his old uncle. But really, what that is metaphorically is talking about the need to sort of take what is good and change and move away or kill the old thoughts and values and belief systems that are not beneficial. And really, the benefit, the ultimate outcome is about an effective and efficient society. And so that was really one of Maui's first steps. The next one is Ahuava, Paihumu, and Anu'u. And these really talk to these structures, these ceremonial structures, where our ancestors came and offered offerings and sacrifice. And so this is really where we start to look at, like, how do we consider our organizational structure in order to create the most effective change and to allow for innovation to happen and to really connect us to the ancestors and the environment, and to our spirituality. And in particular, we were looking at, like, the innovations that come from these different types of structures within our culture. The third one was Manaya Kalani. Now, Manaya Kalani, like I said a little earlier, is a magic fish hook, and it was the fish hook used that Maui threw into the ocean and pulled up the islands. However, what's interesting in that story is they weren't supposed to turn back and look at what islands were being pulled up, but one of Maui's brothers turned back, which then broke off the rope and then didn't get the full breadth of the archipelago to be pulled up. And so there's still islands underneath our water, as I'm sure you've heard, that are now volcanoes that are still erupting. So again, it has many layers of understanding. But what we looked at, when we looked at as far as like a change process, we looked at the need and the magic that comes around identifying and acquiring the right skills and tools in order to do the work and the resources necessary. And so that is a very key component as we look at this. Additionally, Manaya Kalani is a navigational feature in our skies. It's a star constellation. And so we want to make sure that our resources are mapping out so that it helps for the best outcome and the journey towards that outcome. The next area we looked at was Olapi Moya Kapeva. That really talks about a particular type of fish and all of his generations and all of his genealogy. And so again, when we looked at it as a change, from a change lens, we needed to plan beyond our current generation. And that there was a need for transmission of not just our ancestral knowledge, but of the current knowledge. And so we really looked at this connecting to human resources and capacity development, not just as human resources as like that's a department within your organization, but the human resources of the community and how we are beyond our organization developing those resources and the capacity development for future generations. And then the next one was Pe'a. And so Pe'a is the most, I guess, human-like person in this story. And what he really does is, in the story, he gathers and harnesses influencers. And so for Maui, he was a connector in order to bring in the people that were influencers outside of sort of Maui's realm. And so Pe'a is that person. So really reaching out and gathering. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot one other thing. In the Olopi Moi, really, we also looked at that as being succession planning. And so when you think about future generations, we're not only thinking about the elders that passed, but we're thinking about working and being consciously aware of the need to do succession planning. And then our final sort of aha around Changemaker and Maui was Lilo Ke Kau Ya Maui. And so that's really about this time, or the changing and becoming the time of change of Maui. And so this is about aligning your activities to the environment. Now, which was really relevant to us because if you want to go out into the environment and you want to take students out into the environment and you want to see a particular environmental phenomenon, like let's say maybe you want them to study hurricanes and you want them to maybe be able to track it. Well, tracking hurricanes during the non-hurricane season makes no sense whatsoever. Or watching like a blooming hala tree happen outside of when that season happens, even though maybe curriculum wise it makes sense, it doesn't make sense in the environment. So you really have to shift your thinking around how you are planning based on the environment. And so we basically, in Hawaii, we have two seasons. One is the rainy season and the other is what we're currently in, the blazing hot season or the growth season. And so your activities within those seasons change. And so in the wintertime, you're maybe more reflective, you're maybe more creative, you're doing more in-house things. But when it comes to this season that we're currently in, now you're outside, you're actually harvesting, you are actually working and planting the seed for the next season. And so thinking in terms of change, like when is the right time to do certain activities as it relates not just to the environment, but also to the human. And then don't forget, sometimes we put this to the side, but also our spiritual cycles, being in tune with both internal and external spiritual cycles. Really thinking about schedules, cycling, parallel forms in the environment, trends and algorithms, as well as looking at data and how it's related to the entire process. And so I know like terms of data we don't necessarily equate with ancestral knowledge, but that's not true. We were crazy data collectors and we passed those down in oral traditions and stories. And so Maui is one way, story that reveals to us the way that we can organize change and think about a plan of how we want to attack it from a uniquely Hawaiian perspective. Thanks for sharing.
Oh, thank you for sharing, Olani. I think that's such a wonderful, beautiful example of how you were able to rediscover an indigenous logic model. And I see others commenting in the chat box also agree. So some thoughts maybe to take it to continue us through is, what are some steps maybe that you could take in your community to rediscover an indigenous logic model? Maybe it's through studying those traditional stories, or maybe it's examining our native language, or engage in some of those traditional ancestral practices too that inform the culture. So yes, we have a question here. So how do we get these models incorporated into the mainstream systems? Well, maybe by talking about them, using them, or sharing them is one of my first thoughts. But I'd love if others have some thoughts about that as well. And how if you have examples, maybe you've done a little bit of this work, maybe you've uncovered some things. If you'd be willing to share in the chat box, that would be really, really wonderful. We have another example that we want to share with you here as well. So many of you are familiar with the American Indian Higher Education Consortium, or AHEC. It's a consortium of 37 tribal colleges and universities. Many of you work with these colleges and universities already. And one of the resources on their website is under the tab of Indigenous evaluation. You'll find there a link of a link to collect, excuse me, you'll find a link to document collections, where you'll find an online book with this full Indigenous evaluation framework. This framework is something that they developed, with through consulting with members and focus groups and interviews and reflections, and some, taking these ideas to the community to create this entire document. The piece that we want to share with you right now is really where the chapter where they look at, called Creating Our Story. And the AHEC Indigenous Evaluation Framework defines strategies and approaches for evaluation through an Indigenous lens. And in the chapter that we're sharing here, they really write about the relevance of storytelling and sharing lessons and teachings within the Native communities, and the importance of telling our story through that evaluation process. The authors, they write about the first step in this process, in this evaluation process, being to reflect on what your programs are intending to do, and really encourage drawing out that logic model as a way to communicate your story in a way that communities can relate to and understand. On the screen is an example of their of a logic model on page 47 of the chapter. It's about a summer employment program, and you can see that they use some imagery of a rock formation and a desert setting. It includes the same elements that we've been talking about: activities, outcomes, and the ultimate benefits. They have some arrows, of course, but they also use ladders to show, how we're going from one level to the next in terms of our impact and outcome. And I think we're put into the links, into the chat box, the links, if you want to download those as well. But perhaps your mind is going now, and you also have some ideas about images or symbols or stories that can inform your program. And I encourage you to share those in the chat box. So we wanted to share all of those examples and ideas for approaching how you develop a logic model. There's multiple ways to approach this exercise. And so we want to give you a little bit of time now to get into some breakout rooms. So when you get into your breakout rooms, we're going to open them up. They're going to be grant specific. So you can, I know some of you have more than one OIE grant. So it's totally up to you if you wanted, which group you want to join for today. Because our STEP grantees and NAL grantees tends to be a smaller group, we're actually going to put you in one room together. So just a heads up about that. But this is a little bit of an open time for you to work on your logic model, for you to share amongst yourselves. We'd love for you to share, how you're thinking about your activities and how those connect with your short, medium, and long-term outcomes. And also use it as a time to ask each other questions and get ideas about how you're approaching this idea of developing a logic model. If you have some of the materials from session one where you did your partner interview, or maybe you have a template that you started working on, or if you grab that from an email. We're going to pop those into the chat box again right now. We have some templates as well as some resources that you can download from the chat box before you join the room. But we're going to open up the room. Even if you just have a piece of scratch paper where you're going to, jot down ideas and maybe if you're like me, I like to make doodles and draw pictures too, because that's how my brain thinks. But we'll open up the breakout rooms. We'll give you about 10 minutes in your breakout room and a warning message before we close the rooms to come back together. So feel free, you should see that popping up on your screen right now. And if you scroll all the way down in that breakout room dialog box, you'll be able to see some of the others listed there. We'll have a facilitator join each room so that we can be there to help if you have any technical issues or wondering what were the directions again, we'll be there to help. So go ahead, we're going to let you pick which of those rooms you want to join in. And I believe Sarah Brightwell, you're going to stay here in the main room. If anybody wants to join, if you're an ACE grantee and you want to meet with that group, you can just stay right here, right where you are, and Sarah will help get you started over there. Otherwise, I see some folks have started to move themselves. You can let us know in the chat box if you're having any technical challenges. Did somebody have a question?
Sometimes you do have to go to the bottom of your screen and look for one of the options in the bottom that's for breakout rooms, because sometimes that doesn't pop up in the middle of your screen. It'll stay in that bottom menu.
Yeah, it'll have like little squares and it'll say breakouts, and then the dialog box will pop up and you'll see a list of names. And if you scroll all the way down, you'll see some options with the PD, NYCP, null, step. Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you all for I'm sure there was great conversations going on in each of the rooms, and we had a good conversation in the little bit of time that we did have. And I think I heard remnants of a similar conversation as we all came back together. One of the questions that came up for us was, within the organization we have this program, but there's multiple programs, and is it better to have a logic model for the specific program, or one for the overarching program? And our group kind of came to the conclusion that both are valuable, both to be able to document the intended outcomes of a specific program, but maybe it's also important to show how it fits within the larger scope of the work of your organization. So I hope that you're able to share with each other, and that were there any key questions that you want to lift up from your groups before we move on. Okay. I'll keep us going. So right as we were called back into the main room, I think this is where our group conversation started to go, is there's multiple ways to approach this exercise, thinking with the end in mind and working backwards, or going from beginning to end, maybe starting with an indigenous paradigm to an approach to document it. But now that you've spent a little bit of time, working on this, maybe developing it, we want this to be more than just, a pretty graphic that lives on a website or in a pamphlet somewhere, but rather that it's a living document that can serve as a touchstone for your ongoing work. We really are thinking about, going from paper to action now. And so on the screen are a few reflective questions that you can use yourself as you're developing your logic model, or maybe you can even give these questions to a colleague as you put the logic model in front of them and ask them these questions. This is where I think, Clarence, what you started to say right before we came back to the main room is this logic, is it meaningful? Does it make sense? Is it doable? Is it realistic? Is it something that can be verified? Those are just a few checks to be reflecting on as you flesh out your logic model and work on those. So now I'm going to turn it over to Sherry, since we've got about 20 minutes of our time together here. And she's going to share with us a little bit about connecting our logic models with evaluation. So Sherry, over to you.
Absolutely, thank you. So earlier we shared the Indigenous evaluation framework, and we noted how an evaluation should tell the story of your program, and use elements of visual storytelling is a really powerful step to convey your program to your audience. So for the time we have left, we're going to just discuss how your logic model can now connect to and support both evaluation and program implementation. So I'd like you to take a look at this quote. This is from the Kellogg Foundation Logic Model Development Guide. It's been around for a fair amount of time. Take a minute and read it, and type into the chat box a word or a phrase that jumps out to you as significant. You can also feel free to tell me something that you don't like about it.
I see we have a couple of responses in the chat box about effective program planning, effective opportunities, what works and why.
Absolutely. Some of the things that stand out to me are, thinking about better documentation of outcomes. So important, so easy to get lost in the implementation. I'm thinking back to the person I spoke with about native language and the pressure, that they felt that they were under. And documenting outcomes is probably at the end of the list of priorities in some respects, but so important to others who are funding that work. So that's stuck out to me, that juxtaposition and that the pressure that we're always under to document our outcomes while we're, it's like the flying the plane, analogy. You feel like you're under so much pressure to do everything all at once. But the logic model helps us to break it down and think, very strategically, even from the beginning, about how we are going to measure those outcomes. So that was very helpful for me. I see some other people are saying beneficial evaluation tool. Yeah, it is a beneficial evaluation tool. And, I really find it very useful in program planning, and then in sharing with stakeholders. And I think a number of other people do too as well. So thank you for that. Now I'd like to move forward and just mention briefly how I think about the evaluation cycle. So oftentimes, as you're beginning a new project, you're in the zone of needs assessment. You may be doing that as you're writing a grant. You might be doing it in the first year of your project. But the needs assessment data can give you supporting data and information about what is or what is not already working, and what the priorities and the needs are that your program will address. And then in your second year, you might find value in evaluating the fidelity of implementation. So you've begun implementing the program, and now you need information about needed improvements to your processes or your training. And this type of training can give really important insights about the consistency or the quality of the activities that are taking place. And fidelity basically means that the activities consistently align with the purpose or the criteria or the standards. Maintaining fidelity to your program purpose and criteria can be important for obtaining those long-term desired outcomes. And in fact, knowing how well activities were carried out can lead to those critical insights when the final outcome or impact evaluation takes place. It can help you unpack and better understand those impacts. And then finally, as you head into your outcome or your impact evaluation, you're beginning to collect outcome data so that you can evaluate the impact and you can measure the effectiveness in a very, concrete way. And sometimes that means involving a comparison group. Let's move forward now into how we can start to connect the dots with aligning the logic model and the evaluation. So this table shows how the elements of a logic model can connect to the various types of evaluation we just introduced. So, for example, a needs assessment is just simply a type of evaluation that connects to inputs. The information that we gain from this type of evaluation can inform you about the type of resources available and the needs of your community. Second, a process evaluation can inform you about the outputs and determine if you're connecting with stakeholders and delivering the activities and services that you intended to deliver. And it might give you critical information about adjustments needed in the process, or if you've hit some roadblocks along the way and need to do a bit of problem solving. Third, an outcome evaluation yields insight about whether you are achieving your desired outcomes. And then finally, that impact evaluation attempts to make the connection between your activities and the changes that you're striving for. So, given these 4 types of evaluation, are any of you pursuing evaluation in your programs right now? Are you planning to use any of these evaluation types? I'd love to hear from anyone who wants to come off mute, or if you want to share anything in the chat box. And while you're thinking about that, I'm just going to talk a little bit more about indicators of success, but please, feel free to share with us any evaluation work that you're already doing. So we often hear about these indicators of success, and Sarah always says, this is the proof. Like, where are you going to get the proof that your program works? So before you can begin an evaluation, regardless of your purpose, that first step is defining what success looks like. We've said that a few times today and during the first day. It's such an important conversation to have. It cannot just be assumed. If 5 people come in the room together, they're all going to have a different assumption about what success is. So talk with each other about what success looks like and then determine how it's going to be measured. This practice of beginning with the end in mind is an effective planning step, especially with logic modeling. And we've got 3 big questions that can be the starter of this kind of discussion. How will you know success when you see it? What is our evidence going to be? And what specific indicators will we measure? So these sorts of indicators will help you share evidence with your funders, with your your grant funder, that you have the proof that this program is working. And now I'd like to look at yet another example. This is an example of how indicators can relate to both outputs and outcomes. So as I read these, think about what other indicators you might use for some of these examples, because these are just really simple and basic ones. So first of all, when your program is implemented, there's some things that you can count to provide evidence of your implementation. So for example, the number of workshops that take place, or participant feedback about the quality or the usefulness of your workshops. Then we may have the population in focus. In this case, it's teens who are interested in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and they're getting involved in a robotics workshop. So for teens involved in this program, you might just simply count the number or percentage of teens attending the workshops. and that's an appropriate output. Now, if we go down the line to outcomes, our example lists teens that are practicing the creation of a robot to solve a problem. And the indicator could be the number or percentage of teen participants who practice the technique learned in the workshops. And then a longer term outcome is that the teen participants build a robot that competes in a game. And that game, they have to stack blocks in 4 corners of a field, and they've got to move those blocks. So they've got to design a robot that can do that. Well, how do we measure the success of that? It could be, once again, the number and percentage of teens who are reporting an increased understanding of robotics and how it works. Or it could be the number who enter and compete in a game. Doesn't matter if they're, the winners of that game, it's that they built the robot and they competed in that game. And there could be photography, there could be video that demonstrates that. And you could also do video examples of students discussing how they built that robot, using knowledge of engineering and mathematics to do so. So we do have a blank cell here, if you've noticed. So underneath the cell that says, teens learn about robots and how robots can be used to help humans complete work. And what types of skills are needed to build robots? So, how might we actually be successful with this? What might be an indicator of this? So take a look at that empty cell, and you can type something into the chat box, or you can take yourself off mute. But what might be a good indicator? Oh, I like Trinidad Yazzi's question. How would you plan for unexpected situations using the logic model? I love this question. And I will get to that in just a minute. But some of the things that we might do in terms of thinking through an indicator for this particular short-term outcome about teens learning about robots, it could be teachers observing the classrooms and taking notes of students at work and the types of work that they're doing. It could be the student completion of various tasks. Maybe they have a list of 8 tasks that are broken down that help them build that robot that can compete in that game. And I see, what percentage feel that they learned the skills? That's actually a great question, Clarence, because when students are working together, what if there's somebody who has a lot of experience in this area and they're doing all the building and the other 5 kids aren't doing anything and they really haven't learned anything because someone kind of took over? I think that's a really great question. And I think in this example, we could add that 3rd row and talk about unexpected situations and how we might problem solve. So thank you very, very much for that. I'm aware of our time and I just want to move forward, I think, to the very end. I think we'll save this little logic model example and thinking about our process until next week. But I'd like to just make sure that we address any questions you have and that we have the appropriate amount of time to give you some information about next week and your preparation. So maybe we can skip down to our reflection piece. So, we're hoping that as you reflect on today's webinar event, you can think about your program logic model and how it can illustrate your intended impact. Think about how that logic model may naturally lead to where you are at in your individualized evaluation cycle. Are you a 1st-year grantee? Are you a 3rd-year grantee? What does that mean for where you could be in evaluation? And then be thinking about data collection methods. And next time we're going to talk a lot more about data-driven decision-making. Be thinking about what you can use, what you already have available to support both a logic modeling and your evaluation. So thank you very, very much for your time today. And I'm going to transition back over to Tracy now, and she's going to prepare us for next week.
Sure. Thanks, Sherry. I know there's more we could definitely get into when we're talking about evaluation and indicators. And so I do want to just give an opportunity for folks to ask any questions that came up for you as we talked through that briefly just now, or any of the questions that you have thoughts about on the screen right now.
Yeah, we're happy to answer any questions you have. We're also happy to dive a little bit more deeply into this as a little bit of review next time. And it really does lend itself very well to data-driven decision making.
Yeah,
I think, yeah, this is Ben. I think you should cover, sorry, quality assurance. How are you intervening if something goes wrong to in your logic model? If you're not expecting the unexpected, how are you going to intervene and correct an issue?
Yes, absolutely. You know, whenever I write a grant proposal, I often include a table that lays out potential problems and potential solutions. And I think that if we could take that type of thinking and build it into our logic model, that can be very helpful in preventing, you know, unforeseen circumstances that can just throw everything up in the air and create chaos.
Exactly.
Tracy brought us over to this slide, which we were trying to represent a little bit of this here.
I think I saw an indication of a red line. I briefly looked at it.
Yes, exactly. And so it helps us think through the process of program implementation and then that program evaluation piece, how they connect. What do you do when something goes wrong? Well, you have to rethink, retweak, and then start reevaluating the work that you're doing. And, you know, if you're not meeting benchmarks, maybe that requires some filtering back into your program model and some tweaking of that program model. So this is something that we can definitely revisit next week as well. But you can see here how the evaluation process is an iterative process. There is no perfect program and there is no perfect evaluation. I can talk in 1 minute about this teacher home visit program that I mentioned early on. We, you know, we're hoping that this was going to be a major success. Luckily, we were looking at the data midstream. So teachers were supposed to be doing all of their visits in the summer. We learned very quickly that they only got about 20% of them done. That doesn't mean that they weren't hard at work. It means that they were having trouble connecting with families. And so we had to consider, we had hoped the teachers would do 2 home visits throughout the year. We backed that down to 1 in the first year so that we could be successful at that. And then in year 2, we started figuring out a strategy to get 2 home visits done. So that is a, you know, kind of a perfect and very simple example of this kind of iterative evaluation process.
I have a question. Sorry, I'm thinking about, I guess, well, you know, I'm helping with the ACE grant. And so, you know, a lot of that is, you know, focusing on the students directly, right? So we're trying to get the services provided for students, and, you know, and I guess the side benefit also, if it benefits families. But I'm thinking people that are also doing the actual programming for students. So they're the ones that are teaching or doing activities with the kids. So they themselves also, I'm sure they do self or program reflection just to see how they're doing with their own, you know, whatever, how they're implementing their programs. So I guess I'm just trying to understand like how much you can influence that, I guess, or how much can you, because I guess what triggered this for me is when Benjamin was saying, if something is not going in the right direction, how do you try to get it back on the right track, I guess. So I'm just thinking like there's certain partners that you may have that may be harder to maybe control, you know, because you don't have really the direct, I don't know, influence or impact on them. So, but you want to make sure things are going right for the students.
Clarence, I have been in your shoes many, many times. I'll just say very briefly that, you know, in one case, something that worked for me was I had a colleague who was not involved in the project, but had wonderful facilitation skills. And I asked to have a group meeting where we debriefed on not just that one program, but 3 different programs to talk through you know, potential problems that we've all seen and how we might identify solutions. And I asked this kind of personal friend to facilitate that session. And that was very, very helpful. So it didn't look like we were, you know, focusing in on one program. Oftentimes they know, and just asking very open-ended questions about how things are going might elicit some of the discussion that you're probably hoping to have. And, you know, it's just a matter of doing it delicately and allowing that kind of open space, you know, for them to feel safe to discuss problems that they might be having if they're a vendor of yours. Tracy, I don't know if you have other suggestions in this case. This is a tricky one.
Yeah, well, I was thinking that it was a great segue to our third session, at least your response to the question and what might it look like to have those conversations with your partners. Certainly, you know, I think there's some relationship building or maybe some expectations defined, you know, when you're building those partnerships about, you know, how those, you know, what the expectations are for program implementation, but also maybe to have some of those data-driven conversations to inform the ongoing implementation. And we're definitely going to get into that and share some different practices and strategies for having some data-driven conversations with your partners. I know, I think several of us on the TA team can stay on a little bit longer if there are some more questions, but just in case you have to get going, we have a couple of polls, a couple of feedback polls. One is on the screen right now. We've got some responses to that, but also there's a link in the chat box. If you could also take a couple minutes to respond to those questions. They're a little bit different, telling us about how well we met our objectives. And then I'm going to put on, while you're answering and responding to those, I'm just going to put this upcoming events on the screen right now so you can see what's coming up. We have some our next conversation around data-driven decision-making and building off the lodging model series will happen next week on the 22nd. Got some talking circles and office hours lined up at the end of the month. And of course, our contact information for all of your program officers, pardon me, as well as the TA team there. So please feel free to reach out with more questions. I can hang on for a little bit longer. I think some of others of us can as well if you want to, if you have a few more questions to chat about. But otherwise, we hope that you'll be able to join us for our third installment of this series next week. I see Yvette has a question about our Padlet. Let's see if we can pull up that link while you're still here.
Pop that in.
Okay.
I saw that there are a few suggestions coming up for software to build a logic model, and I just really appreciate all of you who threw some of those suggestions in the chat box. I wanted to mention them for anyone who's still listening. Benjamin mentions Microsoft Visio, which I have not used. So we may have to get Benjamin to do a little show and tell for us sometime. And I think that would be really helpful. And Sarah mentioned Word, PowerPoint, and then Canva. as another potential solution. So thank you very much for those. We're always on the lookout for those ourselves. So if anyone has other suggestions, please recommend away.